this is what late Putinism looks like. It looks like the late Soviet Union, in which elections are just sham civic rituals, in which an increasingly aging leadership is clinging on to power desperately, knowing full well that to abandon power is to basically be putting all your fate and fortune in the hands of your successors. And frankly, they don't trust their successors. And a Russia which, under the pressure of a massive burden of military spending, about 40% of the federal budget, is sliding slowly into economic stagnation, but nonetheless, for the moment, can sustain itself. I mean, as someone who, basically just started getting interested in this country back in late Soviet times, which immediately dates me, and who did his PhD in the sort of dying dog days of the Soviet Union, 88 to 91, this all looks, terrifyingly and depressingly familiar.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with a former advisor to the Foreign Office on Russian foreign and security policy. Professor Mark Galeotti is the author of more than 20 books on Russia, and he hosts the podcast series In Moscow's Shadows. Mark Galeotti, welcome back. Thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
In a recent article for The Times, just before the Russian election results, you wrote that the only real question to ask was the scale of the landslide victory that Putin would award himself. Well, his system over-delivered both in turnout and results, didn't it?
It did. And I think, frankly, that's a message in and of itself. We know from a whole variety of polls that were carried out before the elections, as well as statistical analysis of the actual results, that the real figure was probably around 60%. I mean, still enough to win, but not enough to give him that kind of convincing mandate that clearly he wanted. But the fact that they've gone so far to this record result, 87%, on a record turnout, clearly it's a signal. And it's a signal that, to be honest, is a statement to the Russian people, look, this isn't true, but what you going to do about it? It is a power flex. And I think it's part of this transition of late Putinism into a sort of shabby late Soviet kind of model, where elections are not about the masses deciding who will rule them. It's about the masses being required to demonstrate their subordination to their anointed ruler.
And can you just give us a snapshot then of the extremes to which officials went to make sure people did vote and voted for Putin?
Well, we start with there's a lot of what we could almost think of as pre-rigging, making sure, for example, not only that no real opposition candidates are actually on the ballot. I mean, the closest that came to it was a man called Nadezhdin, who, frankly, was not really a sort of a leading opposition figure. But even then, they decided to chicken out and denied him the chance to be on the ballot. And so they ensured that essentially Putin was up against political pygmies, people against whom he could not but look like a grand statesman and a colossus. I mean, you had an ultra-nationalist largely known for a string of rather shabby sex scandals. We had an aging communist who was not even the Communist Party leader, but clearly was just simply the sort of sacrificial victim. And we had a relatively young opportunist who, look, I have watched all of his party political broadcasts, and I still don't know what he stands for. It seems to be something about youth and technology and robots, but beyond that, no idea. So they make sure that there's no real sort of opposition. They make sure they have a total stranglehold on the kind of media coverage beforehand. And then on the 3 days of the actual election, firstly, they introduce a lot of electronic voting, which obviously is far, far easier to rig when you control the system yourself. Then they carry out the good old-fashioned forms of ballot box stuffing. We've seen even, frankly, pictures from the webcams in polling stations of people ramming sort of stacks of polling papers into the boxes. And what's called carousel voting. We literally bus collections of voters around to multiple polling stations where they all get to cast their vote. So you've got all the old-fashioned style. And then the final stage is in the count. Again, it's the Kremlin that controls the count through the Central Electoral Commission. And so it's clear that in many cases, they just simply transferred votes across. So the votes that were cast against Putin were just simply reallocated to Putin, and often in a very clumsy way. I mean, we see a lot of round numbers, suspiciously round numbers, again, which is a sign not just of rigging, but of the kind of blatant in-your-face rigging. The Russians have this word, vranье, which is for a type of lie. It's the type of lie that, I say, and you know that it's a lie, but there's nothing really you can do about it. It's a lie that is also a challenge. And that's what we saw here.
And we also saw the strong arm tactics as well in the occupied areas of Ukraine, didn't we?
Yes, we saw people being sort of basically, knocked on their doors and a requirement to go and vote. We saw cases of police officers actually checking ballots before they were put in the ballot box, completely against Russian law. But it should hardly surprise us that that's done. And again, very little attempt at subtlety. There's all sorts of ways that this could have been handled with a lot more deftness and discretion. And frankly, we know that there are people in the presidential administration, deeply morally bankrupt, but not stupid people, who could have handled this differently. The fact that they didn't is not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to.
Were you surprised that it was so blatant?
I mean, I'm not sure if surprised. I mean, I didn't think it was a given. I mean, I thought that it was still that they could have gone either way still at this stage. But on the other hand, even before, it was clear that was one of the possibilities. And in many ways, it absolutely sort of tracks with other developments that we've seen, which is essentially that the old days when Putin tried to rule behind a veneer of legality are clearly falling apart. And we're now in this much more crass banana republic stage of Russian authoritarianism.
It's really interesting, though, because he talks now about democracy, doesn't he? Is that a veneer, or is it kind of like, again, taunting people, saying, challenge me if you dare?
I think there's an element in which actually Putin genuinely doesn't understand democracy. I mean, this is the trouble. We use these words and we sometimes don't really think about what they actually mean. I think Putin, remember, this is a man who has not spent real time in the West, and didn't even really study the West. Even when he was a KGB agent, he was in East Germany, in some ways more Soviet than the Soviet Union. And I think when he says democracy, he doesn't mean the whole architecture of what makes a modern democracy, which includes, for example, open access to the media and all these other kind of things. He just thinks democracy is the majority of people voted for me, that makes me boss. It's a very simplistic notion of democracy, but I think this is it. And he likes to use the language because it emphasizes this element of popular support. But this is it. His notion of democracy is nowhere near ours.
So the presidential election has been denounced by Western leaders, as you'd expect. But there were congratulations from the leaders of China, North Korea. India's prime minister offered his warm congratulations, and Putin replying that he looked forward to developing their special relationship. Does anything surprise you or alarm you in the global reaction?
I think it's, again, an interesting signal rather than anything else. We see this emergence, shall we say, of an alternative global system. One could almost describe it. Again, I don't want to make this sound as if it's too Manichaean, too much about we got some kind of grand struggle in the world. But broadly speaking, there is an increasing push against the current global order, which is seen as essentially structured by the West for the West's own advantage. And countries such as India in particular, who are not, let's face it, India is the world's largest democracy, and it may have its imperfections, but nonetheless, it is not a kind of fake democracy like a Russia. But nonetheless, even countries like India do feel themselves sort of chafing at this system or whatever. And Putin has really quite effectively presented himself as the great sort of champion of the rest of the world. And although I think in many cases this being done very cynically, both by Putin, but also by other countries, nonetheless, it is quite convenient for a lot of countries to have Putin as this sort of icebreaker, ploughing into the global order, the Western-dominated order, and they can then sort of basically follow in the channel that Putin has created. So I think if we track all these various leaders who express their approval of Putin's election, sometimes it's just simply countries that have reason to need Russian support still. And in other cases, it's just countries that, quite frankly, are benefiting from this current situation, not least because they can play Russia and the West off against each other.
And you describe this as a psychological and political watershed moment. Who for, and how will this election change Russia?
I think, again, there's always a danger in putting too much emphasis on the election itself. In some ways, I do think the election is a signal or a way station in a process that, frankly, has been happening. And really, ever since the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, I think has been in train. This is what late Putinism looks like. It looks like the late Soviet Union, in which elections are just sham civic rituals, in which an increasingly aging leadership is clinging on to power desperately, knowing full well that to abandon power is to basically be putting all your fate and fortune in the hands of your successors. And frankly, they don't trust their successors. And a Russia which, under the pressure of a massive burden of military spending, about 40% of the federal budget, is sliding slowly into economic stagnation, but nonetheless, for the moment, can sustain itself. I mean, as someone who basically just started getting interested in this country back in late Soviet times, which immediately dates me, and who did his PhD in the sort of dying dog days of the Soviet Union, 88 to 91, this all looks terrifyingly and depressingly familiar.
And I know you've done a sort of a very close forensic look at his recent annual address a couple of weeks before the election, and having given the voters no choice in the president that they have, what message do you think the Kremlin is taking now to ensure as much support as they can, or at least acquiescence from the public for the next term?
Yes, I think there's two real messages. One of them, and again, this is so similar to Soviet leaders forever saying that the glories of socialism were just over the horizon, any day now. Well, likewise, Putin lays out this vision of a Russia which is not only proud and strong on the global scene, but also one in which actually there's prosperity for all and good benefits and great infrastructure and all that. It is just over the horizon. Why is it stuck over the horizon? Well, this is his second part of his message. It is precisely that Russia is under attack. And it's a beleaguered fortress. And it's not just about Ukraine. In many ways, the interesting thing is actually how little he talked about Ukraine before the elections, precisely because he knows that for most Russians, this is not a plus. Most Russians are either confused by what's going on or actively opposed to the war. Not that they can do anything about it, but they think it's a bad thing. And in that context, he basically frames Ukraine as just one battlefield in this political, economic, social, cultural war that the West is fighting against Russia. And so I think that's the thing. And in that situation, it provides him with that justification to basically say there is no more middle ground now. You're either a patriot, which means you do what you're told, or you're a traitor. The days when, as there was in earlier Putin years, where there was a bit of room for kind of loyal opposition, there was a bit of room for civil society and so forth. That's all getting squeezed down.
It's really interesting that you say patriot or traitor, because traitor is the very word he's just recently used to describe those pro-Kiev forces that have been leading those incursions into Russia from Ukraine. It really serves as narrative, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And look, we know from his own statements that Putin draws a line between enemies and traitors. Enemies you fight against, but you might well be able to reach some kind of a deal with them in due course. Traitors, though, you can do nothing with traitors but eliminate them. So precisely from his point of view, there is that sense that anyone, and he lumps together not just, ethnic Russians who are fighting for Kiev, but also the political opposition movement. He lumps them all together as traitors these days, which is why it's becoming increasingly dangerous, not just in Russia, but even, we had the attack on one of the sort of Navalny movement's leaders recently in Europe, where he had his car window smashed, he was attacked with a hammer and tear gas and so forth. But even out, the idea is that basically now to be opposed to the Kremlin in whatever form is to be a traitor to Russia.
You said earlier that Ukraine was just one part of the big picture of Putin's kind of portrayal of Russia being under attack. And you believe that at one point Putin entertained the idea that there was a possibility of stepping down. But since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he realizes now he's stuck. So is he now inevitably on a course to keep that war going? And if so, how long can he do that for?
He doesn't necessarily need the actual shooting war in Ukraine to go on forever. Though, unfortunately, I would suggest that Russia has at least 2 years, and probably substantially longer, in the tank, shall we say, for that. But even if there is some kind of peace in Ukraine, what Putin absolutely can't abandon is this wider war narrative. He will frame this as, whatever he gets in Ukraine, he will say, oh, it's a great triumph, given that we were up against not just the Ukrainians, but the whole serried ranks of the United West. But the point is, the United West is still our enemy. And we still need to be vigilant, and we still basically need to be on a wartime footing. I think this is it. Putinism is now permanent wartime Russia. And so that is not something he can abandon. So even if we were willing to bury the hatchet after the Ukraine war, and let's be honest, we won't be. There will be no return to the status quo. There will continue to be all kinds of different sanctions and restrictions. But regardless of that, ironically enough, Putin couldn't even accept that.
Do you think he can keep the country, though, on a permanent war footing? How long can he do that for?
Sadly, if one thinks about the Soviet Union was frankly in that footing for decades. Now, this is not exactly the same, and not least because the Soviet Union, even in what later on became its own sort of shabbily cynical way, it did have an ideology beyond just nationalism and authoritarianism. Marxism, Leninism, ironically enough, did actually have some sort of power to still motivate people even towards the end. So I think things are very different. But on the other hand, I think we have to recognize that the current regime is strong but brittle, I would say. It can cope with the day-to-day pressures for really quite some time. And things will just get a little bit worse for ordinary Russians year on year, but not catastrophically so. And, the pressure of the war will continue to sort of eat into the reserves of the economy, but not catastrophically so. But the point is, in politics, you're not always dealing with the day-to-day. There's going to be stuff happening. There's going to be some kind of black swan events. And the annoyance is it's impossible for us to actually predict quite what and when. But I think the regime is much, much less capable of dealing with the unexpected crisis than it was in the past, because in some ways it's eating away its reserves of legitimacy and of resources in order to deal with that. So, it could be that Putinism can survive as long as Putin does. Or it could be that in a couple of years' time, there's going to be some kind of economic crisis, which leads to protests on the streets and defections within the elites. That's the situation. It's so hard to be able to know.
How far do you believe Putin's ambitions go? The Economist suggests that threat is far beyond Ukraine and Europe, but that he could spread more discord in Africa, the Middle East, cripple the UN even, and put nuclear weapons into space.
Well, I think we have to recognize that I don't think there's no real signs that Putin has any wider territorial ambitions. Ukraine, as we know from his rambling historical lectures, not least on his interview with Tucker Carlson, Ukraine is something that matters to him. He thinks it is rightfully part of Russia's great geopolitical patrimony in a way that he doesn't think about Finland or Poland or wherever else. So I don't think we need to anticipate territorial ambitions. But on the other hand, absolutely, from his point of view, the only real line to some kind of victory in Ukraine is by disrupting the West. So long as the West is willing and able to support Ukraine, it's very hard for Russia to make serious headway. And in fact, it's going to get harder after the end of this year when European ammunition production really starts ramping up and so forth. So he, like any good geopolitical guerrilla, is trying to move the battle into where we are weaker, which is, from his point of view, because we're a constellation of democracies with all kinds of disagreements within and between our countries. So absolutely, he will continue to try and spread dissent, to try and put groups, individuals and countries against each other, and indeed project out into Africa, Latin America, anywhere else where he can distract us.
It's really interesting because a recent exclusive interview that was given to a UK TV channel, President Trump, well, not the former President Trump, but maybe the new President Trump once again, has said that he could talk to Putin, that he could exercise, I don't know, some kind of diplomacy. I mean, what kind of effect do you think another President Trump would have on Putin's behavior and ambitions and relations with Moscow?
Look, I mean, I think like so many, I'm looking at the possibility of a second Trump presidency with a certain amount of dismay. When it comes to this, though, I mean, I think we have to recognize that Trump's rhetoric and Trump's actions are often very, very wildly different. Yes, he claims that he has a special relationship with Putin, but let's be honest, he has never met an autocrat he doesn't like and that he doesn't claim thinks he's wonderful. In practical terms, yes, he might well want to bring some kind of an agreement to end this war. In practice, though, all he can really do is to bring pressure to bear on Ukraine. He could try and absolutely stop financial and military support for Ukraine in a way of forcing Kyiv to accept some kind of really ugly deal. Now, that is not impossible, but it would carry political costs for him, because actually it would more or less mean that Ukraine loses something, if not the whole war, as a result. And unfortunately, Europe cannot pick up all the slack if America stops. But if we look at it, actually Trump's first presidency, maybe his only one, policy towards Russia was tougher at the end of that presidency than American policy had been at any point since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in part, that's because basically Congress took over policy. And in part, it's because behind the rhetoric, actually, Trump went with the line of least resistance. So I think we'll have to wait and see. I know that there is a sort of sense that if the Ukrainians can be looking like potential winners by the time of the inauguration of a new presidency, then the hope in Kyiv, but also amongst its supporters, is that actually Trump can be encouraged to support them, because Trump likes to be associated with winners, not losers.
Just to go back to something you said before, comparing what's happening now in the Russian Federation with the dying days of the Soviet Union, what do you think will come next? I mean, obviously not what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it does look, and you've talked about this before, that Putin is preparing for the post-Putin era. What do you see?
Well, I mean, I don't think Putin's preparing necessarily for a post-Putin era. I honestly think he doesn't really care what happens after him. In that respect, he is, and I don't want to draw too much of a comparison here, but like Stalin. But also, as happened when Stalin died, I think precisely that then actually power will become sort of parceled up and divided and agreed within the elites. But the point is that what Putin, I think, is beginning to show is an awareness that the political generation immediately below him, the people who essentially are in charge of his state for him, so that the 60-somethings and the late 50-something-year-olds are actually increasingly dissatisfied. They're unhappy with what's going on. They're unhappy with the direction the country is heading. They're unhappy with the fact that the 71-year-old Putin and his septuagenarian cronies are still hanging on in power, so they're not getting their chance. Now, this wasn't really a problem if Putin was thinking about potentially relinquishing power. Now I think that Putin is basically stuck in power because he can't afford to do so. He's clearly thinking long term. And one of the things he's doing is looking at the next political generation below, the 40-something, shall we say, and trying to basically win a whole new generation of supporters from the ambitious, lean and hungry wannabes there. So that in some ways he can pit them against the political generation above them. And it's a potentially high-risk strategy because, it actually could mean real sort of tensions within the elite. But that seems to be happening. We're seeing both within business, new opportunities are being given to a younger generation of minigarchs, not the old oligarchs, and likewise in politics.
When you talk about tensions within the elite, the current elite, he's now decrying them, saying they've done nothing for society but line their own pockets. And he's trying to presumably create some kind of tension between them and this new elite he's trying to create. How is the old elite reacting to this?
I mean, at the moment they're not, but we've got to bear in mind that if nothing else, there's going to be a government reshuffle by definition. When Putin is starts his new term, Then the cabinet all submit their resignations, as is often the case in these systems, and he appoints a new one. Now, although almost certainly the current Prime Minister, Mishustin, will remain in position, and generally speaking, the cabinet will be there, I think there is some sense that everyone is just holding fire a little bit at the moment, because they don't want to be rocking the boat just at the point when Putin could dismiss them or similar. There's really not very much that they can openly do. I mean, in some ways, these people, they're powerful figures within the system, but ultimately they're Putin's hostages. He can get rid of anyone he wants at any time, and he's made that perfectly clear. So I think what we're more going to see is, you might say, tensions between the generations. And in some ways, again, that's classic Putin. He likes to play divide and rule. Now, as we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny, that can be disastrous when he loses control over it. But nonetheless, for 24 years, Putin has remained in direct and indirect control of this country, precisely by generating tensions within the powerful people in the system, pitting them against each other, and maintaining his position as the great decider who can resolve any of their disputes.
Do you think we're going to see any cabinet reshuffles?
There's going to be a bit of a renewal. The interesting things to watch are whether or not his first deputy chief of staff, Sergei Kirienko, who's the guy who basically orchestrated these fake elections, and who is also at present a key figure in precisely shaping the new elite, whether he actually comes in to what will presume to be a first deputy prime minister's position. If so, he is clearly a guy to watch, because he was once a liberal, and he's reinvented himself now as a very hardline Putinist hawk. So he clearly has ambitions. So that's the one. And the second thing is, again, whether we see relatively younger figures like the Minister of Agriculture, who happens to be also the son of Putin's closest political ally, Nikolai Patrushev, whether this guy gets promoted. So it's not going to be dramatic. It's not going to be a sort of a complete purge, but it'll give us indications as to which way Putin plans to go in his next term.
Just to touch back a little bit on the election, you said earlier about Putin holding people hostage, and I know that you think that when you think of the Russian people and the public, that we should think of them as being held hostage by Putin and not in any way supporting what he does and what he stands for. How significant do you think the small amounts of dissent you saw in the voting were? And do you see is there any kind of small spark there that might one day become something bigger?
Yes, look, I mean, I should say at the start, look, it's not that I think that all Russians are opposed to Putin or anything like that. Absolutely not. I think there are still a lot of people who are broadly supportive of Putin, not least because they don't know anyone else. And also within that, there are those, about a quarter of the population is probably supportive of the war. So we've got to recognize that. But nonetheless, if one looks at the results, look, what's really interesting is, although there's still more work to be done, there's been a lot of statistical crunching of the polling data that we've had, which interestingly enough still goes down to a lot of actual polling stations specifically. And look, there's suggestions that anything up to half the votes were faked. They either were created out of nothing, or they were existing votes that were just simply transferred to Putin from other candidates, which again says something about the fact that this regime does not have the kind of grip on the country it had. Then we saw the protests, tens of thousands of people who came out for the funeral of Alexei Navalny, and then in subsequent days to put flowers on his grave and so forth. And the interesting thing was actually that the state let it happen. And I think, again, it says something about a slight timorousness within the authorities, that 100 people get together, they'll send in the National Guard to crack some skulls and drag people off to prison. 1,000, 10,000 people, actually the Kremlin thinks, let's just basically let this pass and so forth. So, I mean, you might say it's not so much whether I think there's positive sides. I mean, I think there is. It's clear that so long as the opposition can get together, so long as they could have their, for example, noon against Putin protests, where the idea was that everyone should go and vote for whoever they're going to vote at midday on the last day of the elections on Sunday. And we saw, again, long queues outside a lot of polling stations. As long as people can realize that they're not alone, that even if they can't openly protest, nonetheless, they're not alone in being unhappy with the situation, then that spark of dissent remains. And if, as and when, whether it's wider crises or Putin getting ill or whatever, but once a window of opportunity emerges, that spark can quite quickly become a fire.
What about the West's strategy towards Russia? How developed do you think that is, and how comprehensive do you think that is? But Putin's recently said that he wants to be part of the decision, or made clear he wants to be part of the decision-making process on a global scale, have a voice on key global issues. How should the West react to that exactly? Because the suggestion is that they're consumed with the current in front of your nose crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. But what about the bigger picture?
Yeah, I was going to ask you quite what the West's strategy towards Russia was. I think this is the problem. We haven't got a strategy. And in part, that's because, look, a strategy is essentially a roadmap to a particular end result you want to have. And sure, we would like the end result to be peace in Ukraine and the occupied territories returned to Kyiv and a Russia that is no longer hostile, antagonistic, willing to destabilize Europe and beyond. Well, that's lovely, and I'd like that too. But there's many other things I would also like that sort of somehow don't materialize naturally. We don't really have a sense of how we get from there to here. We don't even really have a sense of quite what victory or defeat in Ukraine mean. Whether it means all occupied territories returned, that's often our kind of official position, but you talk to people off the record and they give a much more nuanced or, shall I say, flexible perspective about whether maybe Crimea might be different. And likewise, if we talk about Ukraine being defeated, some people think of that in terms of that would mean that the Russians control the whole country and we have Russian tanks on the Romanian border. Other people think that just simply if Putin holds on to what he's got now, that's a defeat for Ukraine, which I think it is. So I think in this context, we really have a problem. And I think we have a problem precisely because you talk about the problem in front of your nose. This is something that is not going to be resolved in any one electoral cycle. I mean, actually, the best security guarantee in the long term for Ukraine and the West is a happy, stable, prosperous, democratic Russia that accepts national borders and doesn't want to try and destabilize anyone else. Given that we can't create that, and hopefully we can have that someday, maybe in a few political generations' time, but we can't create that now, we're not really sure if we're just simply about containing Russia, whether we should be trying to influence Russia to change its policies. In some cases, some people are saying we should be thinking of regime change, which I think would be a very dangerous policy to go by. But I think this is it. We have no Western strategy. And therefore, in a way, by default, we focus on the immediate day-to-day, can we get enough artillery rounds to Ukraine and so forth, which is important, crucial, but it's not enough to be a strategy.
And do you have a view of what the strategy should be?
I mean, I think the strategy is to a large extent, I mean, obviously, while supporting Ukraine to the fullest, it is about containing Russia, but it is also about looking to a post-Putin Russia. I think this is one of the crucial things. Look, Putin and his system, maybe they're going to be gone in a year's time. I think it's unlikely, alas. Maybe it's going to be a decade. But the point is, at some point, this system will change. There will be a new leadership. There will be a new opportunity. And we're not really thinking about that much. And I think one of the key things that manifests itself is, look, whether I know how far it's true is almost regardless, but actually it is politically useful to reach out to the Russian people and say, we know this is not your fault. We are not opposed to Russia. We are not opposed to Russians. We are opposed to the Kremlin and its policies at the moment. And in fact, we think Russians are great. Dostoevsky, best page turner ever, or whatever we want to say. And I think at the moment we have fallen into a certain habit where it's a nice, quick political hit for a politician to say something particularly sort of extreme about Russia. There are some who talk about the need to decolonize Russia as a code word for basically breaking it apart. We give Putin wonderful propaganda ammunition all the time. Back in the Cold War days, we, and I think particularly Britain actually, but anyway, generally the West, got very good at political warfare. And lo and behold, when the Soviet Union fell, at first people were in the ex-Soviet states were desperate to get close to the West and so forth. We need to recover a lot of that old expertise and deploy it for the 21st century, which means a different way. It's not going to be radio stations, it's going to be online and so forth, but we need to be doing that.
Really interesting. Mark, just finally, at the beginning I said that you've written 20-odd books on Russia and you've got a new one coming out this year. When is it exactly? It's about Prigozhin, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's a study of. I mean, I wrote it with my wife Anna Rutunyan, who was until she fled Russia. I mean, she was a long-term journalist, had been political editor at the Moscow News, and there's a lot of books about his mercenary organization Wagner that are on the way. Some very good books. This is actually about Prigozhin, the man, looking at how a guy from a really rather boring middle-class family in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, became first a criminal, then a convict, and then sort of built this sort of commercial empire, which made him not just a lot of money, but also persona non grata in the West because of interference in the American elections, and then becoming the key figure behind the Wagner mercenary army. And so it's not just about Prigozhin, it's about using him to explain how this system works. That in fact, Putinism depends on a whole bunch of these opportunists who have no official position, but nonetheless who will do whatever the Kremlin needs doing, and who are spending half their time trying to work out what they think the Kremlin's going to need doing tomorrow and ensuring that they're well placed for it. So, so it's basically a study in, the Putinist elite when we move away from the government ministers and the generals, but are the people who are really the bedrock of his system.
What's it called?
It's called Downfall: Prigozhin, Putin, and the Struggle for a New Russia.
I look forward to talking to you about it. Mark Galeotti, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.